The latest installment of the Institute for Carbon Removal Law and Policies webinar series. My name is Will Burns, and I serve as co-director of the Institute. As all of you know, in recent years, especially in the last year, there's been a proliferation of so-called net zero carbon emissions pledges by national governments as well as by subnational units, including states and localities, as well as a large number of pledges by corporations. And one of the things that I've thought for a long time is that it would be really good if somebody did an assessment in terms of the robustness and the integrity of those so-called pledges. And by God, somebody has. And so a report was released very recently called Taking Stock, a global assessment of net zero targets. And we're fortunate enough to have three of the authors from that report today that will provide a synopsis of the findings of the report, and then we will open it to questions to try to drill down a bit deeper. So at the outset, I'd like to introduce the three speakers in the order in which they'll make their initial brief interventions. First, Steve Smith, who serves as Executive Director of the Oxford Net Zero Initiative at the University of Oxford. Second of all, Kate Cullen, who is a PhD student in the energy research group at the University of California at Berkeley, as well as a researcher at the University of Oxford. And then finally, Richard Black, who is with the Energy and Climate Intelligence Unit in the UK. And we will start our presentations with Steve.
Thank you very much, Will, and it's a pleasure to be here, so thanks for inviting us. I'm just going to start the presentation, and I trust, Will, you'll tell me if there are any problems. So I'll start just with the first 10 minutes or so, giving an overview of our findings from the report and the analysis that Will mentioned. And we titled this Net Zero Targets: The Good, the Bad and the Ugly, because as you may well be aware, net zero pledges really weren't a thing until a couple of years ago. And I think it's surprised everyone just how much this concept has kind of gripped and become the main framework, the defining frame of reference for climate action, which is broadly a positive thing. But there are also concerns that, you know, maybe not all net zero pledges are all they're cracked up to be. And what is the level of integrity involved, as Will said. So before I move on, I will just give the caveat that this is a snapshot of where we were towards the end of last year, because that's when we closed our data analysis. And we're actually very much hoping that we're going to keep this live and updated, but this is the latest version we have. So the entities we covered, it's quite a broad range. We looked not only at all the countries as they are registered as parties to the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change, but we looked beyond national level pledges as well to states and regions in the 25 highest emitting countries. We looked at all cities around the world with a population above 500,000. And we looked at the 2,000 largest publicly listed companies, the Forbes Global 2000. So we were looking at national level net zero pledges, regional city level net zero pledges, and also net zero pledges from the world's biggest corporations. And what we found, just one headline to start with, certainly at the national level, was net zero really, in terms of pledges, covers the majority of human society at the moment. So 61% of global emissions, over 2/3 of gross domestic product, and over half of the world's population is covered actually by a national net zero pledge, which is really quite a surprisingly high level of coverage. But of course, the question is, well, how much can we really trust these net zero targets? And so in order to come up with this estimate of robustness, we drew inspiration from the UN's Race to Zero campaign, which you may be aware of. This is a big push by the high-level action champions appointed by the UN in the run-up to COP26. This is really aimed at getting non-state actors involved in climate ambition and to encourage net zero pledges. But they recognize very quickly that there needs to be what they call as a metaphor, the starting line for the race to zero. what's the minimum level of criteria that should be met by pledges in order for them to qualify to be part of this race? And we at the University of Oxford worked very closely with them on developing these criteria. And there are essentially four very high level ones, which you'll recognize hopefully as common sense really. Number one is come forward with a pledge at a high level of seniority from the organization involved. And that needs to be for net zero emissions by 2050 at the latest, broadly aligned to what the IPCC has said is necessary for meeting the 1.5 degree global temperature goal in the Paris Agreement. But beyond just the pledge, you need a plan. So you need to set out how you intend to achieve that net zero target, and you need to get on with things. You need to proceed. So show that you are acting now. And I think we know that in order to be serious about net zero, that involves a whole lot of transformation, and it's not really credible to say we're going to do all of this further down the line. There's a lot to do now. And then number four is publish. So actually report at least annually on your progress so that there's transparency and accountability as to how you're doing. So those are the 4 Ps we took inspiration from. And we went through the targets and really compared them to our interpretation of these 4 Ps. Now, the first one, of course, in the pledge is about pledging by 2050. So if we look at countries on the top left, states and regions on the top right, cities on the bottom left and companies on the bottom right, this is just a set of bars showing when they are aiming to get to net zero emissions. And we take a fairly broad interpretation of net zero. So we also looked at climate neutrality, carbon positive, net zero greenhouse gases, net zero CO2 only. There are some quite interesting things in the underlying data about differences across those, but we're taking a broad interpretation at this stage. And you'll see, perhaps unsurprisingly, that the vast majority of pledges out there are aiming for this 2040s, 2050 window, given that this has become a real kind of guiding star from the IPCC report. But there are some other interesting differences. So that bar for after 2050 in the countries, that is solely made up of one country, China, aiming for 2060, of course. And actually, interestingly, in companies, you see quite a spread with some ambition before 2050. And that's also true to some extent for states and regions aiming to get there by 2030 as well. If we move on to look at, well, how serious is this commitment? And particularly for countries, what level of policy commitment is there? So is this something which is actually part of legislation, or is it in a policy document such as an NDC under the UN process, or merely just something that's under discussion? Then we see quite a lot of variation, and really a lot of these targets are aspirational, proposed in discussion or in some kind of document. A small proportion are actually in law. A very small proportion of companies as well as countries claim that they are net neutral already. Now, there are interesting questions to unpack there. Some of the countries, for instance, are claiming that because of natural carbon uptake in their land use sector in forests, that they are net zero, but there are issues with passing what the human component and the natural component to that balance is. And with companies, of course, as we will see later, there are questions of offsetting and how net zero is defined. But then this is a slightly more complicated bar, so apologies for this, but this captures 3 of the other Ps actually. They're having a plan that's published and in the public domain, reporting on progress, so the reporting mechanism, and then the interim targets we use as a broad proxy for proceeding. So are people committing not just to a net zero target in the long run, but to do something in the near term, as well as to what extent they consider equity. So their target being a fair share of global action, given that some need to and can do move faster than others. So what we see here is a mixed picture again, certainly not straight hundreds across the board. Countries are a 100% for interim targets because they are required under the Paris Agreement to submit NDCs. But of course, it's important to highlight that we are not commenting on the consistency of those NDCs with net zero targets. We're just saying that they do have some kind of interim targets. And we see that by no means all countries, and certainly very few cities, for instance, have actually published how they intend to achieve these targets. I'm going to move on now to talk about offsets, because I think this is one issue around net zero targets that's become a particularly hot topic, maybe picked up by Richard and in the discussion later. Net zero obviously can be achieved by just cutting all your emissions to zero. It could involve removals, carbon removal, which could happen, within your own scope of activity, or could be a traded offset. But there's actually a whole menagerie of traded offsets out there that are renewables projects, clean cook stoves, energy efficiency projects, forest preservation, and real questions about how additional these things really are and whether they really work. Certainly over here in the UK, that's a live discussion around net zero targets. So we looked at to what extent, based on publicly disclosed information, these entities have said something about the use of offsetting. And a small number of entities are saying they will achieve net zero explicitly without the use of traded offsets. But then of those that the vast majority, of course, are saying they will use offsets. And actually, the thing that's a bit of a worry for us is the not only the number that don't really give any restrictions around quality of offsets, but just don't specify. So the dark brown bar, or actually give no information at all, the data not found bar. So there's a real lack of clarity actually over the role of offsetting within many of these net zero commitments at the moment. So just to sum up from my point of view, really, there's more work to be done on the quality of net zero targets. What's been really encouraging is the quantity that have come forward. And actually, there are some good examples of best practice, which we highlight in our longer report. But in terms of how many meet all four of these high level criteria for quality, we find that around a fifth, 20%, actually meet the bar for all of them. And if we look at individual quality criteria, around 60% include interim targets, so some indication of near-term action. Similar proportion include a commitment to regular, so at least annual reporting on progress. And just under half actually have published a plan for how they intend to achieve this net zero target. So clearly more work to be done. That's the global snapshot. But we have got information in more specific areas. And one of the pieces of work that we did off the back of this, led by Kate and colleagues, was to focus on the United States, actually. So I'm going to hand over to Kate now to talk about that.
Great, thank you, Steve. I will just quickly pull up my slides. Thank you so much, Steve and Richard. What an honor and how exciting to be on this panel with you today. And a big thank you, of course, to our hosts at the AU Carbon Removal Law and Policy team for bringing us all together. Now, as Steve mentioned, I'm going to turn to the US context specifically and run through some of the work that we've done recently there, building off of the global report. And what I'll try to do in the process is elucidate some of the good, the bad, the ugly, and I'll just sneak in there maybe the hopeful trends that we're seeing as well. So around election season in the fall, we became curious to dig specifically into the state of play of city, state, corporate net zero policymaking in the United States. We were curious to see how extensive and strong of a foundation the incoming Biden administration already had to build a major federal net zero plan in the United States. And from the database that we accumulated for the global stocktake, we pulled the US specific data, which included all 50 states, cities over 500,000 inhabitants, and companies that are headquartered in the United States that are on the Forbes Global 2000 list. So for those entities, we went through the same comprehensive review process, data collection process, and updated the data to February 2021. So that's one small difference to mark here. And to evaluate the quality of those targets, in other words, the strength of that non-state net zero policy foundation, we drew again from the Race to Zero campaign criteria that Steve also ran through for us. So I'll just jump straight into our findings. Broadly, we found 173 million people, or 53% of the US population, accounting for a double counting of states, cities that are within states, live in a jurisdiction with a net zero target. And when we stopped data collection in February, a further 5 states and 9 cities, accounting for a further 32 million people, had started discussing setting a net zero target. And if they were all adopted, this 53% figure would rise to 62%. We also found US headquartered companies accounting for at least 5.2 trillion and yearly sales have committed to net zero. And as of February, net zero targets had been set by a total of 17 US states, 34 cities, and 132 companies in the US. And we say at least, again, because we didn't look at every single city and every single company that is in the United States, but rather just those largest actors. Turning to what we found on the quality of those targets. Just first to be clear, a quick note, we considered a target to be robust, drawing on the Race to Zero criteria, if it met the pledge, plan, proceed, publish criteria, and additionally incorporated the leadership practices of reducing the full scope of emissions, all types of emissions, setting limitations and restrictions on offsetting, and folding principles of equity into their plan. And here's what we found, mapping the coverage and quality of net zero targets in terms of population coverage as of 2019 for US states and cities here in green, and then in terms of yearly sales in 2019 for companies. And so we found only 11% of the US population is covered by a net zero target that can be considered truly robust, or in other words, is equipped as it currently stands to deliver the emissions reductions needed to align somewhere near the Paris goal of reaching global net zero before 2050. And for companies, that robustness figure is even lower at about 0.3% of total US annual sales coverage. So data on individual subnational and corporate emissions contributions were not complete, reliable, and publicly accessible. It was not a data set that we unfortunately could find. So we weren't able to do this analysis by actual emissions contributions, which, of course would be fantastic, but unfortunately wasn't an option. So to draw out more of that nuance in differences in the quality of targets, we also mapped city and state targets, shading them, as you can see here, in terms of their alignment to the Race to Zero criteria. So we split this up a little differently. The targets that do not yet meet the 4 Ps of pledge, plan, proceed, publish are labeled as in progress. And we also grouped those in discussion targets, or some would say aspirational targets, together with that group. And then targets that meet the starting line criteria are labeled as good to go forward. And targets that additionally meet the leadership practices are labeled as robust. And you'll see Alaska is not on this map for space constraints, but it does not have a target currently. And as you can see, New York State, Austin, Sacramento, Los Angeles, and New York City are the US subnational entities, at least as of February 2021, that we found data that we could consider them robust. And you may be wondering, for example, why California and their net zero plan was not considered robust. And that's because we considered targets that have been set, codified in law, or in the cases of cities and companies, clearly folded into an operational strategy, such as a strategic plan from a mayor's office or a corporate governance document from corporate leadership. Those we considered robust. And in the case of California, their net zero target is currently set in place by executive order, although that will most certainly change very soon. So the main takeaways, just to start seeding them here, is we found the US has a broad foundation of local net zero ambition on which to build a robust national decarbonization pathway. However, discrepancies in the quality of these targets highlight the need for strong federal leadership to raise the bar for existing subnational and corporate targets, and to spur further ambition to meet the goals laid out in the Paris Agreement. So around these findings, we developed a 4-pronged approach for US federal net zero action that revolves around that framework of the 4 Ps. We published these recommendations as a follow-up to the White House Climate Executive Order in January. And just in summary here, they include codifying a US net zero pledge that includes a 2030 50% interim target and all emissions into federal law. And through that law, setting clear criteria, particularly around equity and offsetting, proceeding by harmonizing federal proceeding by harmonizing federal recovery spending and policy frameworks with net zero. So we were quite happy to see, how the infrastructure bill was presented, and but we also think it would be strategic to go further by developing net zero benchmarks, for example, for heavy emitting sectors, and implementing conditional bailouts for recovery spending that may be non-green. And finally, we recommended the federal government create a more centralized system for annual updates on subnational corporate and further federal progress as well towards the US net zero goal. And so since we published these recommendations, the US government submitted their NDC in April, which is constructed around a net zero trajectory and includes a 2030 interim goal of 50 to 52% emissions reductions. And while it's still in committee, in March, the Clean Future Act, HB 1512, was introduced in the House by Congressman Pallone, who is chair of the House Energy and Commerce Committee, which is the committee in the House with the most jurisdiction over climate issues. This is quite promising. And overall, looking through the bill, we have seen it's a very promising piece of federal legislation, and the most promising we have right now to legally codify a US net zero target. It will certainly reach the House and Senate floors, although it's less certain how much of its substance and funding may be stripped away in negotiations for it to be passed in the Senate. So that brings me to the ugly, which of course is US Senate procedures and partisanship. But I'm still hopeful that HB 1512 will pass, and I'm curious to hear from the participants we have here. I'm sure there's many who are working on this, what they think as well. I think it's quite interesting. The bill relies on state implementation. It requires states to develop state climate plans aimed at the national 2030 and 2050 net zero goals, and empowers the EPA to evaluate and keep states accountable for those goals. And so this state-centered approach may make the bill more amenable to states that are slower to change, although it may also allow for some of those discrepancies in the quality of targets and the real world emission reductions that they lead to, those discrepancies to persist. So it gives me hope. Also that the bill includes funding for climate justice. There's a grant program included to the tune of $1 billion every year from 2022 to 2031, and an additional 100 billion in funding for the next for electrification of the transportation system in the next decade. So that's a good quick overview of the good, the bad, the ugly, and the hopeful. And with that, I'll go ahead and hand it off to Richard.
Great, thanks. Thanks so much, Kate. I'm going to share my screen as well. Here goes. So just a word about me to start with. So unlike Kate and Steve, I'm not a particularly clever person, and I don't have a background in policy or academia. My background's in journalism and communication, and so my main interest in this issue is how it plays out in the big world. And as some of you will no doubt have seen, we have a position where basically there is a perception that there's, well, and sort of a reality that there's a big battle out there now over the worth of net zero targets, the whole concept. And this article came out just yesterday in Yale Environment 360 and really sets out in stark terms. It's a really good example, I think, of the way that some are now seeing this debate. The article kind of goes through all of the different ways in which there are divisions over this, over perceptions of the net zero concept and how it's been applied. And I think it's a question that really matters, actually. I mean, to start with, if the critics are right, then we're in big trouble, because if net zero is not able to deliver the Paris Agreement, then basically, you know, we're into a world of untrammeled climate change, which none of us actually want. But also, if there is a damaging battle where basically, you know, people who are quite keen on climate change spend time shouting at each other, then that's not a very constructive place either, and simply plays into the hands of the climate contrarians. So the first thing I wanted to do really in this session was just to look at where this battle is actually playing out. And there's no doubt that it is playing out in academia. A lot of you will have seen this article in The Conversation, which came out last month by three scientists, including Bob Watson, former chair of the IPCC. I think partly because of his stature, it gained quite a lot of attention. And the article can be read as a collective mea culpa by scientists saying we shouldn't have let ourselves get dragged into this position where net zero is the defining lens through which people are seeing decarbonisation. And Steve and Tom Hale from Oxford and I collaborated on an article which you could see as a response if you wanted to, which is basically saying that, you know, despite the fact that there undoubtedly is greenwashing out there, it's vital for tackling climate change, and basically we kind of need the concept to work. It's interesting, by the way, just apart from the sort of titles of the articles, just to compare the imagery that the editor chose to put on those two articles, with obviously one suggesting a clean energy economy and the other suggesting a continuation of the dirty. So that's the academic side. In politics, certainly in the UK, there's a danger of this opening up a kind of partisan divide, which we haven't had for a number of years in the UK, actually. In contrast to the US, the UK basically, pretty much across the political spectrum, parties have been united in their belief that combating climate change and decarbonisation is a good thing. But here's a piece just from today in the main left-wing newspaper, The Guardian, basically saying net zero is rubbish because the UK has a net zero target, but it's delivering absolutely nothing. And here's an article from today on a right-wing website called Spiked, which is saying that net zero is rubbish for a completely different reason, because it's going to impoverish people, particularly those less well off. And you see that phrase, green technocrats. So in some ways, what we're seeing over net zero is basically a sort of continuation of that partisan divide, which we've seen in many countries. And I guess my worry is that that divide had been more or less healed, at least in the UK, and potentially over the net zero commitment, it could be opened up again, and that would tarnish everything good about net zero. In the community of people who care about climate change, this is absolutely a battle now. This was a press release that the group 350.org put out last week in response to the IEA report. And it's a pretty strong quote, and they're not alone in saying this kind of thing. Well, I don't know about you, but I think I'm pretty committed to the cause of decarbonisation. I've spent most of my working life in it, and I don't want to be a climate colonialist. So it's not a perception that I find particularly tasteful, but it merits consideration. It has to be thought about, I think, and it has to be thought about partially because the groups that have net zero in their sites are really criticising many other very important organisations. So that little thing that I've put up there, that's from the Race to Zero, and you can see you've got 2,000 plus businesses. Are they all climate colonialists? I mean, if they are, we're in big trouble. And some of the organizations that many of us would see as constructive, like CDP, for example, Science Based Targets Initiative, these are organizations who some on the far side, if I can say, of climate action are coming after. So it is quite a dangerous battle line, and therefore I think it's one that we need to try and avoid, basically, because as I said at the beginning, it kind of just is a distraction really against what actually needs to be done. So after that brief tour d'horizon through what's actually happening in the world, I thought I'd just delve a little bit into what some of these battle lines are, if you want to see it like that, or discussion points. So one of the criticisms is burn now, pay later, as one of the critics put it in a recent comment. The idea that net zero simply delays action. And I think if you look at some people who are talking about net zero, you can definitely see that this is actually true. Exhibit A, Australian Prime Minister Scott Morrison, whose basic plan seems to be, well, we won't actually do anything now, but by the time we get to 2045, there's going to be lots of technology that's developed and we'll just wipe out all our emissions then, which obviously makes absolutely no sense in terms of the area under the curve of emissions, but it also, is simply not going to happen. There's the net in net zero and the accusation that this simply avoids action. And of course, this is, again, there are some net zero commitments where this seems to be true. Exhibit A, oil and gas companies who talk about, yes, okay, making a dent in their own emission, but when you look at what's actually entailed in the plan, it's rainforests the size of Brazil and that kind of thing. Corporate malfeasance, from a general point of view, the idea that corporations will simply promise a lot and deliver little. And while the sort of massive acceleration, the huge, of entities setting net zero targets is clearly great for one, from one perspective, if you really do have 2,000 plus companies that have set net zero targets, and most of them will have done it in the last 18 months, you do have to ask how rigorous a lot of them were in that process. There's a separate argument about whether the targets are too little too late, and you will see groups like Extinction Rebellion basically talking about net zero by 2025 as being what needs to be done. And obviously that can be a little bit of a distraction because although in one sense they're really just simply applying the precautionary principle, in another way it makes, I think, it can lead to a criticism of parts of the environment movement as just being absolutely unrealistic. There's criticism on the basis of equity, and we see, excuse me, we see that a bit in the UK with its net zero target for 2050 for all greenhouse gases, which, because it's for all greenhouse gases, the Committee on Climate Change, the official government advisors say is equitable. It is ahead of the global average pathway that the IPCC has put down, but there are many others who say it isn't. It's just too. It's not the UK's fair share. And finally, something that's a little bit different in this, it's not a public discourse, but it's an academic discourse, is how do you treat the short-lived climate polluters? And this is a real issue because obviously the IPCC now has separated out carbon dioxide from things like methane. But if you look at the UK's net zero target, for example, it is based on the old methodology, the GWP 100 methodology, and therefore puts them all in the same basket. So this isn't this isn't a public spat, but it is a bit of an academic discussion and could potentially go a little bit wrong in some cases. So, okay, what are some of the ways in which we, as the broader community of people that care about this stuff, can actually deal with some of these very relevant criticisms and try to make something good out of them? So the burn now, pay later argument, it is about scrutinising near-term action. As Steve and Kate have laid out, there is this necessity to have a plan and to be doing something about your emissions right now in order to be credible. And I think, we just need to keep pointing that out, basically, asking where is your plan? I've put question marks after this because basically you're lucky it's me talking about this, not Steve, because if Steve was talking about it, we'd have an hour or so to spend on this. So I've just put question marks on there because I think it's a very live debate and I'm not sure what the answer is, to be honest. Corporate malfeasance, well, it just needs to be called out, basically. And I'm looking forward to the day when companies start calling each other out, when constructive companies with decent net zero targets start lambasting the ones who don't and actually separating themselves as the good from the bad and the ugly. The argument that targets are too little, too weak, in a sense, is a slightly irrelevant one, because unless you get started on decarbonisation now, then none of these things will be targets. So none of these things will actually come to pass. So I think that's quite a good answer to that one. Just make a start now, then we'll see. Is it equitable? We just need clarity on the numbers, basically. I think in the case of the UK Committee on Climate Change, they do actually have a good case and they have answered it quite well. And I think the answer on this academic one is that you kind of need everything. There's no point in going to net zero CO2 and just forgetting about methane. it's a rubbish thing to be trying to do. So again, you go to the heart of the problem and not get stuck up on what is a bit of an academic discussion. So some things are still unclear. That one is still unclear. This has real world implications, I think, for countries like New Zealand, which obviously, being an agricultural country, a massive share of its national emissions are in the form of methane. And if you go with the GWP star methodology and simply talk about net zero 2, you're ignoring the huge potential for swift emission reductions that could come from a reduction in its methane emissions. Oil and gas majors also tend to talk about CO2, not methane, for related reasons. I'm personally a bit unclear how we deal with equity, how we should deal with equity for non-state actors, particularly when you've got multinational corporations. How do we deal with equity there? Don't know. I think there are unclear issues around national versus corporate targets. Let's say, for example, you have a country that says it sets a net zero target and says it's not going to use offsets, but then you have a company that's headquartered in that country and they set a net zero target, but they are going to use offsets. How do you deal with that? Don't know. Oh, there we are. Airlines and shipping. If you have a flight that goes between a country with a net zero target and a country that doesn't have a net zero target, and the corporate has a commitment, how do you sort of allocate that between the countries and the corporate? Don't know. This question of separate targets for reductions and removals, you can definitely make obviously a very strong case for it, and you can even make a case for separating out natural and engineered removals just for absolute clarity. But actually, some of the emission reduction technologies, some of the natural approaches to removals, and some of the engineered approaches to removals are all sort of on the horizon, really. So not sure whether that it really is the best way to do it. Could you potentially set targets for things that are certain and you can actually deliver? Would that be a better thing to do? And one big one, I think, which is absolutely out there, is how should all of this be governed and accredited? I came across the other day what I think is a company in London that basically accredited an oil company's net zero target. Well, because they sort of can. And you can see how there's a business model out there in accrediting dodgy net zero targets. So how should all this be governed? I have heard it suggested that basically this should come under the UN umbrella. There's quite a lot to be done before that could ever happen. But certainly, unless someone is accrediting the accreditors, we could get ourselves into a Wild West system with accreditation as well as with the actual net zero plans. And above all, I think we need to nuance these things. There's a huge variety in the credibility and quality of net zero targets, which was one of the reasons why Kate, Steve, and I and the rest of the team did our report, and why we want to carry on with this stream of work. If you focus on the nuance of net zero targets and look at each entity's targets, this is a page that we have for Sweden in our report, and you can see how the different aspects of the quality could be pulled out there. If you do that, you can differentiate good actors from bad actors. You can create a race to the top. You can enable shareholders and campaigners to target their efforts a lot more effectively. You can create competition within sectors. You can have the bodies that work in different business sectors actually getting interested in this and looking at and having their own plans for how to translate some of these things, some of the less robust net zero targets into robust targets. Okay, so with all, I will hand back on that and look forward to your questions and comments. Thank you. Will, I think you're
all right. Thank you, everyone. And with that, we will proceed to the Q&A portion, and I'd encourage you to populate the Q&A box with your questions. We have a couple at the outset, and before I get to that, though, I am curious because Richard did bring up the issue and indicated that Steve had some strong feelings about it, about your thoughts about separating out emissions reductions pledges and and carbon removal pledges in terms of net zero protocols. Maybe start with Steve.
Yeah, Richard's right. We could have a whole extra conversation about this. I think I did write a paper about this. I do recognize that there is a kind of moral hazard risk to some extent on thinking that removals are just something that we can scale and therefore we don't need to do much emissions reduction at all. I think that's the wrong way to look at it. That said, I do think having the net in net zero targets is important because it recognizes that it is sensible to pursue removals as part of an overall climate stabilization strategy. I think the thing that I'm interested in and have done a lot of thinking about is what are the actual risks that people are really specifying when they claim this moral hazard argument? And I think they tend to be several issues which overlap with but are not necessarily exclusive to removals. So one of the issues is this, well, we can just delay net action on emissions and removals anyway because we can overshoot and then return the climate back to some state. And of course, we know the climate is full of irreversibilities. And the way you deal with that is to have the near-term action, be it, you know, net emissions or gross emissions. You need the near-term action to not overextend your carbon budget. I think some other people, when they worry about removals, they're worried about an over-reliance on early stage technologies and techniques. But again, this overlaps with emissions because, you know, discussion about solar powered planes or about CCS on iron and steel, those are often at similar levels of technology development to some of the removals approaches being discussed. I think another concern is that the carbon, once you store it from a removal process, may leak out. If you're looking at trees, that's potentially a particular issue with pests and disease. But again, that's true with forest preservation methods. It's true with even with geological stores. If you do it badly, it can leak, but that comes from, you know, CCS again on point source emissions, not just removals. So I think there are particular risks that need mitigating. Whether or not having a separate target for removals is the right way to do it, I don't know. I mean, I'm not going to die in a ditch over this argument, but I think it's important to recognize that policy making happens on multiple levels. And as we've seen throughout, I think all three talks, net zero targets don't exist in a vacuum. No target does. They're often supported by a whole bunch of other policies and targets. You know, we have renewables targets, efficiency targets, and so on. And so maybe splitting out removals and emissions is part of that multi-layered governance. But I think we need to be really specific on what the risks are that we're actually trying to mitigate through doing that and asking whether that's the most effective way to do it.
Richard or Kate, any follow-ups on that?
I have nothing to add to that note.
Okay. All right. Let me go to some of the questions from the audience. Meyer Weber asks, could you comment more about net zero targets of oil and gas companies?
I'll be happy to take a little stab at that. It's one thing that's remarkable about them is how many of them have done it within such a short space of time. And what I think that speaks to is the growing awareness that they themselves are facing, that they have to do something about this. So a lot of the targets don't have much credibility, frankly, because they tend to ignore methane. They have heroic assumptions about how much carbon removal they're going to have. And some of them don't deal with scope 3 emissions. And if you're basically, you know, let's take an analogy. Let's say you're a gun company and you say you have a pro-pacifism policy, but you don't actually include the use of guns. It's not a particularly credible policy. So we're in that area, I think. But I think the key thing is that once a company has made a commitment, then there's a tool, there's something against which to hold them to account, particularly for shareholders and investors. And if I might just take a little liberty here, Will, also the top question in the list there from Nicholas Watts about the Dutch District Court judgment is absolutely germane here. How significant is it? So I don't know whether it covers all of scope 3 emissions. I haven't read through all the reporting to know if that's true. If it does cover scope 3 emissions, then that's a really big deal for Shell. But I think what's more important is that this is yet another blow for Shell and other publicly traded oil companies, coming on top of the IEA report last week, which is an absolute game changer, saying in their scenario, no new exploration basically for oil and gas. So I think, you know, this is just one more piece, one more weight that they're going to have to contend with as they try to plot a course for their own survival, basically.
All right, thank you for that. Question from Alex Watson. As you mentioned, you took a broad interpretation of net zero, including carbon neutrality. When it comes to companies, can you share what percentage companies had net zero versus carbon neutral or climate neutral targets?
That's a great question, and I can't. The short answer is I don't know, but we would have that data underneath. Kate, I may hand it to you in case you've got some kind of idea, because you were very involved in the coding. I mean, one more general point is there is an issue of kind of terminology and lexicon, and in the Race to Zero campaign, that's been one of our areas that we've focused on in the second iteration. But Kate, I don't know if you want to add anything on that.
Yeah, absolutely. And just on this lexicon piece of what do these different terms mean and how are they being interpreted in our analysis, and then also in practice and how the Race to Zero is kind of shepherding people towards using them. That is all available on the Race to Zero website and is all recently released as full update to all these criteria that was co-produced with practitioners, researchers, and then also this lexicon on these different terms. So in our data collection, we disaggregated, what gases a target would cover, and we found that was one of the more meaningful ways to look at this question and get at that carbon neutral versus climate neutral. And as we were collecting the data, kind of in the early stages, we found that there was such a discrepancy in how these terms were used by so many different types of actors across the world. So while we did capture, the name of, okay, this actor is calling it a net zero target, this actor is calling it a carbon neutral target, here's the gases that they cover, and all the other criteria that we collected data on, we didn't find that, in analyzing it in the report, that it was the most useful way to kind of disaggregate and look at things because of those differences in how the terms are used. So it really just speaks to, that is a key point that particularly for companies and for, for city and state, for so many different types of planners that aren't as familiar with like the nuance of these issues, that there's a lot of work that we can do together to familiarize each other and kind of have a shared definition.
Well, if I could just briefly add to that,
Sure.
Alex, you asked why we did that, and the reason was basically this reflects the real world situation where entities are using these three terms pretty much interchangeably. Really, there's a lack of definition when they say net zero. It's not always clear what they mean. So some are clear on CO2, some are clear on all greenhouse gases. One of the things we wanted to capture in our analysis was lack of clarity. Because if you haven't been clear on something like this, which gases you're covered, or you haven't been clear on how much offsetting that you're doing, then that's something that actually needs to be highlighted, because without the clarity, you can't really begin to judge how serious that entity is.
Thank you for that. Okay, let's see. This may be a question that's beyond the scope of the study, but you probably have opinions in this context. It's from Valerio Magliola. What role should corporates play in funding emerging removal technologies? And most importantly, how should they concretely fund them?
I'm happy to have a go at that, but I wouldn't claim to have the whole answer. We wrote something actually at Oxford University called Principles for Net Zero Aligned Carbon Offsetting last year, which is available on our Oxford web pages, which touches on this a bit. It kind of made the point that if you are pledging to go to net zero, and if you plan to use carbon offsets as part of that, then the only way that you will assist with reaching net zero ultimately is by any offsetting for residual emissions, being offset by similarly permanent removals. And we kind of made the observation that most offset markets don't really have that option because most of these technologies are not really freely available. So we actually in that document give a few tentative suggestions for how companies can get involved in that. I mean, I would say that it's going to be companies to a large extent who actually develop these technologies and innovate. So some of them will play a role in just realizing that they can do removals as part of their operational supply chain or their own core industry. And that's going to, aside from offsetting, that's going to be super important. If you're a pulp and paper mill and you can somehow capture and store the carbon, then you become a removal business as well. But in terms of assisting with developing the market by financial transfers and offsetting, helping in that way, I think there are a few things that companies can do. One is just commit to the principle that if you are going to offset in a limited and controlled way after you've done everything you can on your own emissions, then commit to funding permanent removals and make that an expanding part of your portfolio over time. So you send that kind of directional signal. The other thing is that I think what we're seeing increasingly, and I know Will and colleagues have done quite a lot of work on this, is pledges from the private sector, the companies like Stripe and Microsoft and Shopify, and also ideas out there that are pretty reasonable ideas that just need financing to scale up and try out. And often the two have struggled to coalesce on each side of the market, so pooling supply, but also pooling demand, and then interfacing through a market to provide some kind of long-term stable pipeline for financing these solutions. So I think we're starting to see this, but some kind of positive working together across traditional company lines to commit to long-term finance for these things is going to be great. And but we really need to make sure that we learn the lessons of offsetting that have gone before. And I think they're really important questions as well about monitoring, reporting, verifying, making sure this is really additional. And I suspect that, companies can play a great part in that, but there will ultimately be a role for governments in that as well.
Any additional thoughts, Richard or Kate, on that? Okay. All right, I'll move to, go ahead, Kate.
Just a quick point I'll add in. In this context, it's interesting also to think about the role that corporates can play in funding climate adaptation, especially for vulnerable, most affected communities. And so, when we talk about funding, both in the policy context and in kind of other, corporate collaboration contexts, there's this focus on removals, which of course is so important. And we have less adaptation we have to do if removals and just emissions reductions, just to start with, are prioritized and lower. But at the same time, we just can't pretend that a significant injection of funding isn't needed in the adaptation space as well. And so that's kind of a new dynamic we should be thinking about with this question too.
All right, thank you, Kate. All right, our next question is from Hunter Cutting. You mentioned Australia as an example of a country that is using the concepts of net zero and CDR to avoid near-term action. Do you have a list or table of countries as well as subnational actors who are abusing the concepts in just the ways that the critics of net zero CDR are concerned about?
I can have a go at that if you like. Thanks for the question, Hunter. Great one. So the answer is sort of yes and no. So what we have a massive database basically that captures, massive spreadsheet that captures as many aspects as we can of what countries, subnationals, corporates have said about their net zero ambition. Now that's not public at the moment because we're awaiting. There's an academic paper basically which is going through, and assuming the paper gets published, then the database will be released. So we don't have a column saying, is this a bad actor? But from looking at the various entities, you can deduce what they've actually said. So things like, for example, when they've said something about offsets, you can look at what it is. And you can also look at where they haven't been clear, which is also, as I was saying earlier, I think a very, very sort of key point about this. I mean, we found that the lack of clarity is actually a really big issue. Now, the kind of plan is to keep doing this going forward and sort of have an updatable thing, which then any campaigners or any academics or anyone can basically go and use. And answer exactly this the sort of question that you're posing there, Hunter, and monitor what sort of progress there is, if any, over time.
And I'll just add, in the US context, because we just had less entities we had to kind of parse apart the data for, part of the research we did was looking, which entities are not meeting the Race to Zero pledge plan criteria, pledge plan proceed published criteria, and the leadership practices. And so those that are not meeting any of those, could be considered part of that bucket, at least from publicly available data, not really making a good effort, putting their best foot forward to take action on net zero. And so in the US report, in our appendix, we have the full list of US states, at least, and I'd be happy to send some of that data for cities, particularly after our global report is released, and it's easier to share that data. So if you look at the Oxford Smith School website, the working paper kind of page, you'll see the report there, and you can take a look.
Okay, thank you for that. Okay, we are approaching the 1 hour mark where we need to wrap up. What I will say is that we will archive all of the Q&A from today, including the questions that we weren't able to get to, and place that on our website. But I'd like to invite Steve, Richard, and Kate to make any final comments that they have before we conclude.
If I'm happy to do it in the broad order that we spoke. Thanks, Will. I think I'm incredibly encouraged by the number of pledges coming, not only from countries, but actually corporates and cities and regions in this space. And I think it's more than any of us. I think if you told us 2 years ago that we'd be in this space that we are now, we'd say this is a delightful situation to be in, and the problems we have are problems that we'd rather have than not have these net zero targets at all. So I think we need to strike that balance of recognizing that net zero is an important concept for stabilizing the climate, and it's good that people are latching onto this, with the fact that there's a lot of work to do to actually tighten these up and see through that they deliver. So we're looking forward to continuing working on this and working with colleagues and finding out more about how to actually turn the kind of net zero dream into a reality, really.
Kate?
Yeah, I think that balance, or kind of addressing this tension, is really key in the net zero space right now. And on one side, I can't stop thinking about, we don't have the option to be fatalistic. That's a privilege we do not have. And especially as young people, communities of color, Indigenous folks, just people that are most marginalized, most, at the forefront of this issue, we don't have that option. And so moving forward, we can't, let ourselves become fatalistic. We can't, we don't have time for infighting, for egos, for, all these things that we're seeing. And we really have to find a way to strike this balance between holding, especially, companies and governments that don't have the best track record of action on this issue, figuring out new ways to hold them accountable in this new net zero paradigm, but also find new ways to work together, because 2050 is not as far as we think it is. It's 29 years away, and so we really need to move quickly.
Thank you, Kate. And Richard?
Yes, I mean, the critics of net zero actually do have many. They have a point, definitely, and the key for me leaves, as I was saying, lies in differentiating. I think you can broadly put all the entities with net zero targets into one of three baskets. They're either kind of serious and they've got stuff worked out, which is probably the smallest basket. They're actually just doing it because they think they should, and there's definitely a danger of greenwash. And then you've got a bulk in the middle who recognize the necessity of doing it and are serious about it, but haven't yet worked out the details of how to get there. And I think that's where the opportunity lies, actually. And in the context of the UN process, the setting of NDCs shows that there's a lot of simple measuring and technical work that a lot of nations really need to go through before they can actually put flesh on the bones of their net zero pledges. So the opportunity is there for funders, for developed nations to actually work and turn those things into reality. But we absolutely do need net zero. It needs to work, and it is actually a very rational thing to do. It's far more rational for a company or a country to say, okay, we're going to set course for a destination in 30 years' time, and this is what we're going to do in order to get there. It makes much more sense in sort of investment terms and so on than it does to sort of set a target for 5 years hence without knowing what you're going to do after that. So it's all about the plan and the immediate reductions, as Steve was showing earlier, but it is the lens through which decarbonisation is being seen, and it just needs to work, basically.
All right. All right. Once again, I'd like to thank Steve, Richard, and Kate for participating today, and also for our audience for their excellent questions. This event will be archived within the next few days on the Institute site. I'd encourage you to share it with others that might be interested, and I hope that you will join us for future installments of our webinar. So once again, thank you everyone, and have a great rest of your day.